Hi Year 10, welcome to your second online video for this week. We're going to be completing the lesson today about deposition, beaches and sand dunes. So beaches and sand dunes are two really important landforms that are created by deposition. But I want us to start thinking about, firstly, maybe why deposition happens in the first place. In terms of what we mean by deposition, it's worth just reminding ourselves by having a look at this definition in our booklets here. So deposition is when waves drop the sediment that they are carrying. I'd like you just to pause the video now and just to think for yourself, just for 30 seconds, about the locations or conditions that would cause that to happen. Just pause the video and think about why waves might drop the sediment that they're carrying. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to have a little think about that. I'm going to go through some reasons for you now, and I'd like you to add these into your booklets as we go along. The first and most important thing that happens to cause deposition is that the waves need to lose energy. So wherever the waves lose energy, they are going to drop the sediment that they are carrying. Think about if you were carrying something heavy, and as you started to lose energy, you would want to put that heavy item down, and the waves work in exactly the same way. But we can also be a bit more specific about thinking about what causes the waves to lose their energy. Now, this could be linked with the weather. So one thing that might cause deposition is calm weather conditions. So if we don't have much wind, there's not going to be much energy in the waves, and therefore they're more likely to drop the material that they're carrying. We can also get low energy waves if we have somewhere sheltered. So in sheltered areas of the coastline, the waves are more likely to drop the material they're carrying. Now that could be in a bay, as we've looked at already to do with headlands and bays. We often find beaches forming in a bay because they're quite sheltered, they're protected by the headlands. Or we could maybe find it behind a spit, somewhere else that is sheltered from the oncoming waves. Linked with calm weather and sheltered areas is that deposition also happens when waves are constructive. So where we have constructive waves approaching the coastline, which, if you remember back to our first lesson, have a strong swash, those waves are going to be encouraging deposition. A final reason might be where a river meets the sea. Now that can happen because the river water flowing in one direction and the tides or the waves trying to move in the other direction kind of cancel each other out, and therefore the velocity of the water slows down and deposition is more likely to occur. So these are the reasons why deposition happens, and we can now go on to think about what impact this has in terms of forming beaches and sand dunes. So if we have a look at the picture that you've got in your booklets, you can see a typical photo of a wide sandy beach here. We can see that the tide is out, exposing this wide area of sand. We can see ripples in the sand made by the waves as they've flowed over this beach as the tide has been coming in and out. We can see that towards the back of the beach there's a little bit of a steeper section here. This is what we call a berm, a small ridge that's found on the beach, and then behind that beach we can see that we've got some sand dunes starting to form. And we're going to have a look at the formation of these two landforms, beaches and sand dunes, in a little bit more detail now. So if you scroll down in your booklets, you'll see that you've got some sentences underneath your photograph to complete. What I'd like you to do is pause the video now and see if you can have a go at completing these sentences, making sure that you use the words in this vocabulary box at the bottom here. Make sure you're using these words to fill in these blanks. Okay, hopefully you've had a go at that now and you can check your answers as we go through this. So firstly, beaches form because of deposition. That's the first thing that we should have written in here. Okay. For this to happen, waves must have low energy, and so beaches are often found in sheltered areas such as bays. Wave energy here is less than on the exposed headlands. If you remember back to the work that we did on headlands and bays, remember the headlands sticking out to sea absorb the wave energy, so the bays either side of them tend to be quite sheltered. Waves can also be constructive, where the swash is stronger than the backwash. Hopefully you got those two the right way round. So the material is left on the beach. A berm can be found on a beach, which is a ridge of larger material deposited during a storm. Large rocks can also be broken down into sand by attrition. So any rocks that do fall off of cliffs or are washed onto the beach, they're gradually going to be broken down and ground down into very small particles of sand as a result of that process of attrition. So that's how a beach forms. And now I'd like us to think about how sand dunes form. Before we go on to that, what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to pause this video and I'd like you to watch the Time for Geography video that I've sent you in our email, and I've also put onto Teams. That gives quite a nice explanation of this formation of sand dunes. So I'd like you to pause this video, I'd like you to watch the Time for Geography video, and then I'd like you to come back and restart this video so that we can write an explanation together of how sand dunes are created. What I'd like you to do now then is turn to this page in your booklets, and together we're going to write an explanation of how sand dunes are formed. We want to make sure that we're using the right kinds of terminology, so we're going to be ticking some of the vocabulary off in this vocabulary box as we go along. We want to think about having a nice clear sequence to our explanation, and we want to make sure that we have included as many key bits of terminology as possible. We're almost going to follow this diagram from left to right to think about how embryo dunes become yellow dunes and then become grey dunes as well. So the first thing that needs to happen for the formation of a sand dune is that an obstacle needs to be deposited on the beach. That could be in the form of some seaweed or a bit of driftwood. So let's start by explaining that in our explanation. So firstly, an obstacle, and that could be in the form of seaweed or driftwood. Is deposited on the beach by the waves. Okay, so we can cross off obstacle and we can cross off deposition because we've used deposited here. We may come back and use that again though. Over time, what will happen is that sand will build up around this obstacle. Because it is being blown up the beach by the wind. Okay. The next thing that will happen is that vegetation will start to grow on the sand. Okay. This vegetation is known as a pioneer species. Because it is the first thing that grows on this sand. So we've used pioneer species, okay. We've used grow for that vegetation. A good example of this is marram grass. So we can tick that point off there. This will create what we call an embryo sand dune. the smallest type of sand dune there is. We can see it here in our diagram. What the vegetation will do is it will help to anchor that sand dune together, allowing it to grow. So we can say that the roots of the vegetation, or the roots of the grass, the marram grass, anchors the sand together, stabilizing it, allowing the sand dune to get bigger. Eventually, what will happen is that the embryo dunes will merge together to create a larger dune known as a yellow dune. So we can say that over time, several embryo dunes will merge together, or will join together to create a yellow dune. The reason it's called a yellow dune is because still lots of sand is visible, and eventually that dune will become covered in vegetation until it becomes what we call a grey dune. So we can say eventually more vegetation will grow completely covering the sand dune. Okay, creating a grey dune. I'm then going to carry my explanation on up here. You can carry on going down your page. We can talk about how we've used grey dune, so we can tick that off. Okay, we could talk also about how the vegetation will improve the nutrients in the soil as it dies and rots down. In the sand. What we also get are these depressions forming in between the dunes, which we call slacks. So we can write that depressions, and we're going to put in brackets, slacks, form between the dunes. And we can see with this one that sometimes they fill with water to create little ponds. Eventually, we're going to end up with perhaps that dune becoming woodland as the very final stage. We're going to leave our explanation there though. So we've got that nice clear sequence. We've got that obstacle in the form of either seaweed or driftwood. The sand is going to build up around that obstacle because it's being blown up the beach by the wind. The vegetation will start to grow on the sand dune. This vegetation is known as a pioneer species. Good example of that pioneer species is marram grass. That grass is going to create an embryo dune. The roots of the marram grass are going to bind or anchor the sand together, which is going to stabilize it. That's going to allow the dune to get bigger. Over time, several of those embryo dunes are going to join together. That's going to create a yellow dune, and eventually more vegetation is going to grow, completely covering the sand dune, which is going to create a grey dune. The vegetation is going to add nutrients into the soil as that vegetation dies and rots down, and these depressions or these slacks form in between the sand dunes, which sometimes fill up with water. So we can see how we can go from a flat beach, developing this series of sand dunes as the obstacle traps the sand, and then the vegetation helps that sand dune to grow even larger.